There are two texts this morning, both from the book of Genesis. The problem with both of those texts is in order to more fully understand it, we have to understand what precedes it. That's what most of the Bible is about, understanding the context. So here we go again with one of those teaching moments. Because what I'd like to do is I'd like to frame these two stories within the context in which they were written. Harry Wendt, who has forgotten more about the Bible than I've ever known, says that you can divide the Bible into three sections. 1, Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the world. Genesis 3 through 11, the whole world blows apart. And Genesis 12 through the rest of the book of Revelation is God's loving attempt to put it all back together. Now, I like that. And the family that God picks to put it all back together is Abraham. Now, if there's anybody in this room that likes soap operas, you will love this story because it is the greatest soap opera ever written. It's an amazing story. Abraham's family is a mess. And Abraham himself was a wanderer. You probably know that. He was a part of a group in Old Testament times called in Hebrew a Piru, wanderer, fringe of society, no citizenship, migrant workers, robbers, thieves, bandits. That's who Abraham was. And of all the people that God could have picked to put God's world back together, He picked Abraham. And as we will find out in a not too distant future, Abraham's family is not a whole lot different than Abraham was. So in Genesis 12, 6 chapters before our text, God promises Abraham 3 things: land, offspring, and blessings. 3 things, important things, fills all the rest of the Bible. Now everything gets funny, and everything starts to fall apart. Let me tell you some of these stories. You all know some of these stories. In chapter 12, at the last part of chapter 12, Abraham and his wife Sarah, who at that stage in her life apparently was a very attractive lady, go down to Egypt. And Pharaoh is in Egypt. And what would happen if Pharaoh takes Sarah, thinks Abraham was her husband, kills Abraham to get to Sarah? What would happen to the promise? It'd be null and void. So Abraham comes up with this thing to tell Pharaoh that he's Sarah's brother, which is exactly what they do, and the promise survives. In chapter 13, it was Abraham and Lot who have a falling out, have to go their separate ways, and Abraham tells Lot, okay, you got to leave, but you get your pick of the land. What happens if Lot takes the wrong land? What happens if Lot takes Canaan? The promise is null and void. And then in chapter 16, and here it gets really fun, we have a huge problem. Sarah is barren. She can't deliver a baby. What happens to the promise if Abraham can't have a son? It's done. So Sarah comes up with this idea. She's got a maid named Hagar. And she thinks, Abraham, would you go have an affair with Hagar and maybe that'll help? And Abraham says, okay. So Abraham and Hagar go off and have a relationship. The result of that relationship is a son. What's his name? Ishmael. The problem is that Ishmael can never be the child of the promise. Why? It's got nothing to do with Sarah. Sorry? Yes, it is Abraham's. Abraham is not circumcised. And back in the Old Testament, circumcision is the sign of the covenant that God made with God's people. So a baby out of that covenant can't be the child of the promise. So 1 chapter later, Abraham is circumcised. And the covenant is fulfilled. And the very next chapter, chapter 18, Abraham and Sarah are visited by three men. Let me read this story to you. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw three men. My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring you a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves. So they said, do as you said. Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant. Then he took curds and milk, and they ate underneath the tree. And they said to him, here's where it gets, I think, hilarious. Where's your wife? And he said, there in the tent. One of them says, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife, Sarah, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham were old, advanced in years. The truth of the matter was, Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah would never see 90 again. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. You all know what that means. So what does Sarah do? She laughs. It's better than crying. So Sarah laughs to herself, saying, get this, after I have grown old and my husband an old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the same time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied, saying, I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, oh yeah, you laughed. So do we, don't we? We laugh, don't you? I do, at the preposterous nature of God. Abraham was 100 years of age. Sarah will never see 90 again, and God says you're going to have a son. I love what Fred Buechner says about this. It's like giving birth in a geriatric ward and Medicare, picking up the tab. They laughed at the preposterous promise of God, I think. I think they were laughing more at God, who thought the promise was true. And if it was, then you have really something to laugh at. And what happens? A couple of chapters later, the impossible takes place. And I'd like to read, this is the second text that we have before us this morning. I'd like to read from the Message Bible because it doesn't get any better than this. God visited Sarah exactly as he said he would. God did to Sarah what he promised. Sarah became pregnant, 90, and gave Abraham a son in his old age and at the very time God had said. This might shock Abraham and Sarah, but God said. Abraham named him Isaac. We'll get to that in a minute. When his son was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him. You get the connection here. Just as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Can't you just see that 3 o'clock in the morning? Sarah said, God has blessed me with laughter, and all who get the news will laugh with me. She also said, whoever would have suggested to Abraham that Sarah would one day nurse a baby, yet here I am. I've given the old man a son. Now you can't make that stuff up. I'm here to tell you, if you can't laugh at that, you can't laugh at anything. Abraham laughed. Sarah laughed. Even God laughed. Because God told them to name the child what? Isaac, which is the Hebrew word for laughter. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. It's a good thing because in the next chapter, it's about to get a whole lot worse. And this is a part of the scripture that I will never quite understand. Luther walked around this mountain 10 times and said he couldn't preach on this text. The very next chapter after Isaac was born, God says to Abraham, take your son, your long-awaited beloved son, take him up to Mount Gerizim and sacrifice him. What? It was supposed to be a test of Abraham's faith, and that's what the early church says. But folks, I don't get that. Because of all the people in the Bible, it was Abraham who all of the time was most faithful. What's God doing? Do you get that? I don't. So Abraham grabs a knife and is about to kill his only beloved son, and out of the clouds a voice comes, wait a minute! There's a ram in a thicket bush. Use him. Use him. Do you see what God is doing? In the Old Testament, God saves his people with a ram in a thicket bush. In the New Testament, God will save his people with a lamb on a cross. Do you see the connection? It's really, really important. These two texts are a part of a bigger piece of Scripture that the scholars call the Abraham narrative. But it's not about Abraham. It's about God. It's about this crazy, incomprehensible, radical God who claims impossible things can happen and then delivers on those impossibilities. He picked Abraham, of all people, and Abraham's family to put it all back together. And you know something what's even stranger still? God has picked your family and mine to do the same. As crazy and dysfunctional as all of our families are. Chrissy, God's picked your family. And Avery, God's picked your family. And John, your family. And Phil, your family. And Brian, and Dave, and Margaret. God has picked our families to do what God told Moses, to Abraham to do. Now let's be honest. You can tell God to go take a hike. You can care only about yourself and live in your own little bubble and care only about your own needs and don't give a flip about anybody else's pain and heartache. You can do that. Or you can do exactly what Abraham did. You can claim the impossible promise of God and live the way Jesus did. If you choose that route, the world is likely to hurt you, or worse yet, laugh at you. But that's okay, because God's already laughing. And I want to leave you with this thought. Is there any greater legacy? We talk about legacy here. What do you want to be remembered for? Is there any greater legacy for any of us in this room that long after we're gone, somebody says of Andy and Brian, all of us, somebody says they were the ones that used their lives to help God put it all back together. Now that's something to laugh at.